My next guest in the program is Jason Israel, former Pentagon advisor and, of course, now at the US Navy Reserve. Jason, thanks very much for your time. Let's begin when we're talking today about what's happening with this peace proposal with the Taliban. This is something we've covered a few times. Is it actually a chance of becoming a reality?
Well, I think the number one thing, Tom, to think about here when it comes to this proposal, that it isn't an agreement yet, is to remember that nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to. So what you see is both sides, the U.S. and the Taliban, posturing to say that there have been talks to agreement. Now, this agreement is for a reduction of violence, which is interesting. It's usually the language of ceasefire is used, not reduction of violence. So it's interesting that what this would do is enter a period where it's supposed to be a near ceasefire. Maybe it's possibly recognizing that the command and control that Taliban have over forces that are called Taliban isn't excellent. So it's possible that there could be, some light violence here and there, and recognizing that not a single occurrence of that would throw off the agreement. So that is of interest. But the second piece of it is saying that they're saying that this would lead into a period that would actually allow the Taliban and the Afghan government to commence talks. And we've talked about several times here that it's been several years that the U.S. has been trying to get the Taliban to talk to the Afghan government. So two important pieces here, but the jury is still out.
Given where this has come before, is the real test right now outbreaks of violence, that the stage where it's at right now, if history is a guide, this is where we see a flare-up of violence and a hindrance to getting something done?
Yes, absolutely. So both sides might use a little bit of a diversion to try to say, well, the center of the talk here is trying to get to the goal of the Afghan government talking to the Taliban. So what we're going to do is prelude that with this period of reduced violence. But the question is, what is the Taliban's actual goal? Their stated goal has not changed that much in the last 20 years, which is complete removal of U.S. forces. So what you can imagine is, as they go into those talks, the Taliban will use any leverage that it has to try to ensure that there's a timeline for complete U.S. force withdrawal. Of course, the U.S. force withdrawal would also be politically complicated for President Trump in an election year when there's a lot of support for maintaining at least the training portion of the Afghanistan mission. The latest you've heard from the general in charge of the U.S. mission there is that he thinks that he could withdraw from about 12 or 13,000 troops to about 8,000 troops and still be able to conduct their training mission now. So there might be a withdrawal underway somewhat soon, but not a complete withdrawal.
Big news this week, the Philippines deciding to end its troop agreement with the US. This obviously has potentially big ramifications here in Australia, particularly around, if it's not the US, is it even closer cooperation with China?
Yes, I mean, President Duterte of Philippines has obviously been courting Chinese investment and Chinese cooperation at the same time as maintaining its historical ties to the United States for decades. I think that the Mutual Defense Treaty was signed almost 70 years ago between the U.S. and Philippines, and that remains a very strong agreement compared to others in the region. What happened this week was President Duterte announced, it almost seemed as if it was in response to the U.S. revoking a visa of one of his allies, is that he announced that he would withdraw from the Visiting Forces Agreement. Now, the Visiting Forces Agreement is not the same agreement as the Mutual Defense Treaty. However, the Visiting Forces Agreement does actually refer to the Mutual Defense Treaty, and some lawyers have said that if they revoke the Visiting Forces Agreement, then it might have a follow-on effect. But the bottom line is here is that in the 2018 U.S. defense strategy says the U.S. is in competition with China, and things like this are the scoreboard. This is the chessboard on which the U.S. has said that it's playing, and this is definitely a loss for the U.S. as far as at least in the near term.
To what extent should this be put down to the nature of Duterte as somewhat erratic as a leader, or a genuine push back towards China from Duterte?
I would say that it's very heavily on the way that he reacts, and you can tell that. I think it was during the Obama administration, he actually threatened to withdraw from the Visiting Forces Agreement because they didn't like how the U.S. Was sanctioning a member of one of his allies that was involved with the war on drugs in the Philippines. So he's done this before, but not to this extent. There's also the fact that this has a 180-day review period, so it's not immediately in effect, and it could be used as leverage, but it is definitely a sign that the Philippines are willing to take a step back from the United States as China fills that role, and that does definitely have potential implications for Australia and other allies.
Fascinated to hear your thoughts on Joko Widodo, his visit to Parliament this week, of course. He called Australia Indonesia's closest friend. I don't think anyone would agree with that, but they all saw it as a good thing. An Indonesian leader would say that. How important could this relationship get, given we've just seen Indonesia really stand up to China on maritime borders?
Indonesia is a key player. When you think about the countries that could make or break this chessboard, this chess game that the United States is talking about, Indonesia is one that the U.S. Would definitely want to try to bring it to its side. But Indonesia and Joko Widodo have shown that they are very pragmatic about the relationship and willing to sort of take all offers. So the fact that Widodo was here in Australia and had sort of raising a global profile, I would like to say, probably means that he's actually open to more gesturing from other countries, including China and the United States, in order to get Indonesia on their side. The next question would be things like basing agreements and access to ports and access to economic opportunities within the country. Those are the things that we should be looking out for when you're thinking about this overall, as I've been calling it, a chess game between the U.S. and China and allies.
Can you see Indonesia, and I suppose as well Joko Widodo, or perhaps Indonesia after him, in what I'm talking about this time frame, 10 or 15 years' time, being a really key ally for Australia, the US, others, and part of the bulwark against China? Or do you think the emphasis will remain on the practical? China can easily reach out, offer its own olive branch, and Indonesia's more of a neutral?
Well, good question, Tom. Back to our previous comment on the Philippines. At the current trajectory, the way the U.S. is focusing on the China trade war directly and some of its posturing, it has sort of left its allies behind in that strategy. So at the current trajectory, I cannot picture that in 10 or 15 years. However, if as a military planner, looking at the defense strategy, I would say, what is it exactly we want to have accomplished in 15 years? And Indonesia, being an ally of the United States, would be one. So the question is, what can we change now in that strategy in order to make it happen? But at the current trajectory, I don't see it.
It's something I think all people should be weighing up because, as you said, a big nation, it's going to be an increasingly powerful one as well. So it will be a crucial factor.
Absolutely.
Jason Israel, thanks for your time today.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Have a good weekend.